Before we begin tonight, I want you to think about something you ate today. Maybe it was breakfast. Maybe it was lunch. Think about the tomato in your salad, the potato you had with dinner, the chocolate you snuck when you thought nobody was looking, the corn, the peppers, the avocado. None of it came from Europe. None of it came from Asia. None of it came from Africa or the Middle East or any of the places you were taught were the cradles of civilization. They came from a continent that most history books treat as a footnote until 1492. From people whose cities were so vast, so sophisticated, so impossibly advanced that when the Spanish first saw them, they thought they were hallucinating. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, and dozens of civilizations whose names you've never heard, whose cities turned to jungle so completely that we're still finding them with satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar. They invented zero independently. They built pyramids that aligned with astronomical events thousands of years in the future. They performed brain surgery with stone tools and had higher survival rates than European doctors would achieve with metal instruments 500 years later. They created floating gardens that fed cities of 200,000 people. They built road networks through mountains so steep that modern engineers look at them and quietly admit they're not entirely sure how it was done. And here's what gets me every single time I think about it. Most of what they built, most of what they knew, most of their history, their literature, their science was deliberately destroyed. Burned by conquistadors and priests who saw books written in languages they couldn't read and decided the appropriate response was fire. We lost entire libraries. We lost centuries of astronomical observations. We lost medical texts, historical records, poetry, philosophy. We lost so much that we'll never know how much we lost. And what survived, what made it through the burning and the conquest and the 5 centuries of deliberate erasure, is enough to make you sit down in the middle of whatever you're doing and just stare at the wall for a while. Tonight, we're going there. To the cities that rose in rainforests and deserts and mountain peaks where the air is so thin that just walking feels like drowning. To the astronomers who tracked Venus with accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Europe for 1,000 years. To the engineers who moved 200-ton stones up mountainsides without wheels, without horses, without any technology the old world would have recognized. To the surgeons who drilled holes in skulls, and the farmers who turned swamps into gardens, and the mathematicians who understood zero, while Europe was still counting on its fingers. We're going to meet Pakal the Great, a king who was buried in a tomb so elaborate, so covered in jade and gold and astronomical symbolism, that when archaeologists found it in 1952, they stood in the doorway and wept. We're going to walk through Tenochtitlan, a city of canals and causeways and floating gardens built in the middle of a lake. A city so beautiful that the conquistador who saw it said it was like something from a dream. We'll get to all of it. But first, close your eyes if you like and imagine a jungle. Thick green, impossibly alive, growing over stones that shouldn't be there. Stones too large, too precisely cut, too deliberately placed to be natural. And underneath the roots and the vines and centuries of leaf litter, something is waiting. A city, the largest city in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its name was Tikal. And somewhere inside it, carved into stone, is a date. You see it long before you understand what you're looking at. You've been walking for days through rainforests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. The air is thick enough to drink. Everything is wet. Everything is growing. Vines as thick as your arm wrap around trees that have been standing since before your grandparents were born. Birds you can't see make sounds you can't identify. Something moves in the canopy above you and you don't look up because you've learned that most things moving in the canopy are better left unexamined. And then ahead of you, rising through the trees like something that has no right to exist, you see stone. Not a boulder, not a cliff. Stone that has been shaped, cut, stacked. You push through the undergrowth and the jungle opens up and you stop walking because your brain needs a moment to process what your eyes are showing it. A pyramid, 65 meters tall, steep sides rising at an angle that makes your stomach drop just looking at it. Stairs climbing straight up the face, each step so narrow and so tall that you'd have to use your hands to climb it. At the top, a temple, small, precise, decorated with carvings you can't read from this distance. And this pyramid, this impossible thing rising out of the jungle, is not alone. There are others, dozens of them, some smaller, some just as large, scattered across a landscape that shouldn't be able to support this, shouldn't be able to support a city, but it did. Tikal at its height was home to perhaps 100,000 people. It had pyramids and palaces and ball courts and reservoirs, and a network of raised causeways connecting different parts of the city. It had astronomers tracking the movements of Venus and Mars with such precision that their calculations were accurate to within hours over periods of centuries. It had writers carving dates into stone using a calendar system so complex, so mathematically sophisticated, that it wouldn't be fully understood by modern scholars until the 1950s. The Maya didn't just track time. They were obsessed with it. They had multiple overlapping calendar systems running simultaneously. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day sacred calendar. The Hob, a 365-day solar calendar. And the Long Count, a system for tracking vast stretches of time that measured dates from a creation point in 3114 BCE and could calculate forward and backward across millennia with perfect accuracy. They knew the solar year was 365.242 days long. The actual figure is 365.2422 days. They were off by 0.0002 days, without telescopes, without metal tools. Without any of the instruments European astronomers would use to make similar calculations 1,000 years later. They did it with naked-eye observation, with stone and stucco markers, with patience and with mathematics. And they wrote it all down, on stone monuments called stelae that stood in the plazas of their cities, on the walls of their temples. In books made of bark paper coated with lime plaster, folded like accordions, covered in glyphs so beautiful that Spanish priests who saw them said they were the work of the devil and burned them. We have 4 Maya books left. 4 out of thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex, which wasn't even confirmed as authentic until 2016. 4 books to represent the literary output of a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. Everything else burned. Bishop Diego de Landa, who ordered most of the burning, later wrote a book about Maya culture because he realized, too late, that he'd destroyed something irreplaceable. His book, written from memory and from interviews with survivors, is now one of our primary sources for understanding the very culture he tried to erase. The Spanish saw Tikal and they saw dozens of other Maya cities and they couldn't process what they were looking at. They had been taught that civilization required certain things: metallurgy, the wheel, horses, draft animals. The Maya had none of these things, and yet they had built cities in rainforests where European settlements failed within a generation. They had created art and architecture and astronomical science that rivaled anything in Europe. They had a writing system that was fully phonetic, capable of representing any word in their language, more flexible in some ways than the alphabet the Spanish brought with them. The cognitive dissonance was too much. So the Spanish decided the cities must have been built by a lost tribe of Israel, or by Phoenicians, or by Atlanteans. Anyone except the people who were actually living there, whose descendants were standing right in front of them, speaking the same language that was carved into the stones. It would take 400 years before scholars accepted what should have been obvious from the beginning. The Maya built the Maya cities, nobody else. You're standing in front of a stela now. Temple IV in Tikal, one of the tallest pyramids in the Maya world. At its base, a stone monument covered in glyphs, a date carved at the top. In the long count system, it reads 915-1000, which translates, if you know how to read it, to 741 CE. This stone has been standing here for 1,283 years. The person who carved it knew exactly what day it was. Not approximately. Exactly. They knew what day it had been 3,000 years before they were born. They knew what day it would be 3,000 years after they died. They built a mathematical system capable of tracking time across spans so vast that the human mind can barely hold them. And they did it because time, to the Maya, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a series of cycles, repeating, overlapping, each one carrying meaning. The day you were born determined your fate. The alignment of the calendars on any given day could be auspicious or catastrophic. The movements of Venus dictated when to go to war. The Maya lived inside time in a way that we don't anymore. Every day was a specific, named, mathematically precise point in multiple overlapping cycles. And if you knew how to read those cycles, if you understood the mathematics, you could see the pattern. You could predict the future, not metaphorically, actually predict it. When Venus would rise, when the rains would come, when the gods would be pleased or angry, the Maya weren't guessing. They were calculating, and they wrote it all down so the next generation wouldn't have to start over. You leave Tikal behind and walk west. Weeks of travel through jungle and across rivers and over mountains. And then one morning you see it. Rising out of the rainforest on a series of terraces cut into a hillside, the city of Palenque. Smaller than Tikal, more intimate, more beautiful in a way that makes your chest hurt. The buildings here are different, lighter, more delicate. The Temple of Inscriptions rises in 9 levels, each one smaller than the one below, climbing toward the sky in a stepped pyramid that seems almost fragile compared to the massive structures of Tikal. At the top, A temple with a roof comb, a decorative facade that rises another several meters, covered in stucco carvings of gods and kings and the Maya vision of the cosmos. You climb the stairs. They're steep but not impossible. At the top, you can see the entire city spread out below you. Palaces with interior courtyards, an aqueduct bringing water from the mountains, a ball court where men played a game that was part sport, part ritual, part reenactment of the cosmic struggle between life and death. And below you, directly below where you're standing, something nobody knew was there until 1952. A tomb. The tomb of Janub Pakal the Great, who ruled Palenque for 68 years, from 615 to 683 CE. The longest verified reign of any monarch in the history of the Americas. They found it by accident. An archaeologist named Alberto Ruslulier noticed that one of the floor stones in the temple had holes drilled in it, filled with stone plugs. He lifted the stone and found a stairway descending into the pyramid, filled with rubble. It took 4 years to clear it. 4 years of careful excavation, moving stones, sifting through fill, descending step by step into the heart of the pyramid. At the bottom, a chamber, and in the chamber, a stone sarcophagus. 5 meters long, carved from a single block of limestone, covered with glyphs and images so intricate, so perfectly preserved, that the excavation team stood in the doorway with flashlights and couldn't speak. The lid of the sarcophagus weighed 5 tons. It took days to rig a pulley system to lift it. When they finally opened it, they found Pakal, his skeleton covered in jade. A jade mosaic mask over his face, each piece cut and polished and fitted together with such precision that it captured the contours of his face in death. Jade rings on every finger, jade bracelets, jade necklaces, a jade bead placed in his mouth so he would have money to pay for his journey to the underworld. The Maya believed jade was more valuable than gold. It was the color of water, of corn, of life itself. To be buried in jade was to be buried in eternity. The sarcophagus lid, the 5-ton carved stone that covered him, shows Pakal at the moment of death, falling backward into the jaws of the underworld, down the world tree into Xibalba, the place of fear. Above him, the world tree rises, its branches forming the sky, the Milky Way, the path of souls. A celestial bird perches at the top. The message carved in stone is clear. Pakal is descending into death so that he can be reborn as a god. The carving is so detailed, so specific in its astronomical symbolism, that some people in the 1960s decided it was obviously a depiction of an astronaut in a rocket ship. Because apparently it's easier to believe that ancient Maya kings were space travelers than to accept that indigenous people in the Americas had sophisticated cosmological beliefs and the artistic skill to represent them in stone. Pakal's tomb stayed, sealed for 1,269 years. His jade mask, his jewelry, his bones, all of it waiting in the dark while empires rose and fell above him. While the Spanish came and burned the books and tore down the temples and built churches on top of pyramids, while scholars argued about whether the Maya were capable of building their own cities, Pakal waited. And when they finally found him, he was exactly where his people had left him. Surrounded by jade, descending into the underworld, becoming a god, you leave Palenque and travel north. The jungle thins, the air gets drier. The landscape opens up into the Yucatan Peninsula, flat and hot and covered in low scrub forest. And rising out of that flatness, visible for kilometers in every direction, the city of Chichen Itza. The pyramid at its center, El Castillo, is not the tallest pyramid in the Maya world. It's 30 meters high. Modest compared to Tikal's giants, but it's perfect. 4 sides, each with 91 steps, plus the platform at the top. 365 steps total, 1 for each day of the solar year. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, the afternoon sun hits the pyramid at an angle that creates a shadow on the northern staircase. A shadow that looks like a serpent, descending from the top of the pyramid to the stone serpent head at the base. The shadow moves as the sun moves. For exactly 3 hours and 22 minutes the serpent descends. Then it disappears. The pyramid is a calendar. A giant stone calendar aligned so precisely with the movements of the sun that twice a year it performs a trick of light and shadow that draws thousands of people to watch. The Maya who built it knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the equinoxes. They understood the angle of the sun. They built the pyramid, positioned the staircase, carved the serpent head, and waited. And 1,000 years later, the serpent still descends, right on schedule. Inside the pyramid, because El Castillo, like many Maya pyramids, was built in layers, each new version constructed over the old one like Russian nesting dolls, there's an earlier temple. Archaeologists found it in the 1930s, a tunnel leading into the heart of the pyramid, a chamber with a red jaguar throne, its eyes made of jade, its spots made of inlaid shell. And next to the throne, a chakmul, a reclining figure holding a plate on its stomach. The plate was for hearts, human hearts. cut from living bodies during rituals that the Spanish found so horrifying they used them as justification for everything that came after. The Maya practiced human sacrifice. So did the Aztecs, so did most Mesoamerican cultures. It was central to their religion, their cosmology, their understanding of how the universe worked. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. They had bled to make the sun rise. Humans owed them a debt, blood for blood, life for life. It's easy to focus on this, to let it overshadow everything else, to decide that human sacrifice makes a civilization barbaric, and therefore everything they accomplished doesn't count. Europe was burning people alive for heresy at the same time the Maya were cutting hearts from captives. The Inquisition was torturing confessions out of Jews and Muslims, while Aztec priests were offering blood to Huitzilopochtli. Every civilization has things in its past that are hard to look at. Question is whether you let that erase everything else. The Maya built Chichen Itza. They built the pyramid that tracks the equinox. They built the observatory El Caracol with its spiral staircase and its windows aligned to track the movements of Venus. They built the Great Ball Court, the largest in Mesoamerica, with acoustics so perfect that a whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other end, 150 meters away. They built all of this, and they practiced human sacrifice. Both things are true. You can't understand them if you only look at one. You travel west now, out of the Maya lowlands across mountains into the Valley of Mexico. And there in the middle of a lake connected to the shore by 3 great causeways is something that shouldn't exist. A city, the largest city in the Americas, one of the largest cities in the world. Its name was Tenochtitlan. And when the Spanish saw it for the first time in 1519, they thought they were looking at a fairy tale. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a conquistador who was there, wrote about it 50 years later. His account reads like someone trying to convince himself that what he saw was real. When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis, on account of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. The city had a population of between 200,000 and 300,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at the time, larger than London, larger than Paris. It was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, expanded over decades using a technique called chinampas, floating gardens. You build a frame of wood and reeds. You anchor it to the lake bed with posts. You pile mud and lake vegetation on top until you have a raised bed. You plant willows around the edges. Their roots hold everything together. You plant crops in the bed: corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, chili peppers. The roots grow down into the water. The plants don't need rain. They're surrounded by water. You can harvest year-round. The chinampas of Tenochtitlan produced enough food to feed the entire city. They were so efficient, so productive, that some of them are still in use today in Xochimilco, the only part of the lake system that survived the Spanish draining of the valley. The city itself was laid out on a grid, wide streets, canals running between them, canoes moving through the canals carrying goods, people, everything the city needed. The Spanish compared it to Venice, but Tenochtitlan was larger, more organized, cleaner. The Aztecs had public sanitation systems. They had street sweepers. They had laws against littering. They had aqueducts bringing fresh water from springs in the mountains. They had a zoo, the first zoo in the Americas. They had botanical gardens. They had a library. They had schools. Mandatory education for all children, boys and girls, noble and commoner. Everyone learned to read and write in the Aztec writing system, a combination of pictographs and phonetic glyphs. At the center of the city, the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, a pyramid with 2 temples at the top. One dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. One dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain. The pyramid was 60 meters tall. Sides were painted red and blue and white. At the top, the temples were covered in gold and precious stones. The Spanish saw it and their eyes went wide. And in front of the temples, the skull racks, Tzompantli, wooden racks holding thousands of human skulls, the skulls of sacrificial victims displayed as offerings to the gods. The Spanish counted them, or tried to. The numbers in their accounts vary. Some say thousands, some say tens of thousands. Archaeology has confirmed that the skull racks were real. Excavations at the Templo Mayor site have found them. The sacrifices happened. The scale was enormous, and the Aztecs didn't hide it. They displayed it, proudly. Because to them this wasn't murder, this was the highest honor. To die on the sacrificial stone was to go directly to paradise, to become a companion of the sun. Your heart, still beating, lifted to the sky, feeding the gods, keeping the universe running. The Aztecs believed the sun needed blood to rise. Without sacrifice, without constant offerings, the sun would stop. The world would end. Everything they did, the wars, the captives, the rituals, was to prevent that, to keep the cosmos functioning. They weren't cruel, they were terrified, and they were trying to save the world the only way they knew how. Hernán Cortés arrived in Tenochtitlan in November 1519. He came with 400 men. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II welcomed him, gave him a palace to stay in, showed him the city. The Spanish walked through streets cleaner than anything in Europe. They saw markets selling goods from across the empire, chocolate from the south, jade from the Maya lands, obsidian from the mountains, gold and silver and feathers and cotton and 1,000 things they'd never seen before. They saw the floating gardens, they saw the aqueducts, they saw the zoo with jaguars and eagles and animals they couldn't name, and they saw the gold. Cortés asked Moctezuma to stop the human sacrifices. Moctezuma refused. The gods required blood. Without it, the world would end. How could he stop? The Spanish stayed in the city for months, guests of the emperor. And then in May 1520, while Cortés was away, his lieutenant Pedro de Alvarado ordered a massacre. During a religious festival with the Aztec nobility unarmed and dancing, Spanish soldiers blocked the exits and killed everyone inside. Hundreds of people. The city erupted. The Spanish barricaded themselves in their palace. Moctezuma tried to calm his people. They threw stones at him. He died a few days later. The Spanish fled the city on June 30, 1520, La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. They ran across the causeways in the dark, weighed down with gold they'd stolen, pursued by Aztec warriors in canoes. Half of them died. Cortés sat under a tree and wept, but he came back with more men, with cannons, with smallpox. The disease arrived before he did. It swept through Tenochtitlan, killing thousands. The Aztecs had no immunity, no resistance, no understanding of what was happening. Their emperor died of it. His successor died of it. The city's population collapsed, and then Cortés laid siege. For 93 days, he blockaded the causeways, no food in, no water in. He built boats and controlled the lake. He bombarded the city with cannons. The Aztecs fought back with everything they had, but they were starving, they were dying of disease, and they were outnumbered. Cortés had allied with the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs. He had thousands of indigenous warriors fighting for him. This wasn't Europeans conquering the Americas. This was one group of indigenous Americans using Europeans as weapons against another group. On August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The Spanish tore it down, stone by stone. They filled in the canals, they drained the lake, they built Mexico City on top of the ruins, they burned the books. All of them, every codex they could find. The history, the astronomy, the poetry, the medicine, all of it burned. We have perhaps a dozen Aztec books left, out of thousands. The Spanish built their cathedral directly on top of the Templo Mayor. They used stones from the pyramid to build it. They buried the skull racks. They tried to erase everything, and they almost succeeded, but not quite. Because in the 1970s, electrical workers digging in downtown Mexico City found something. A stone, circular, massive, covered in carvings. They stopped digging and called archaeologists. The stone was the Coyolxauhqui stone, a carving of the Aztec moon goddess dismembered, her head and limbs separated from her body. It had been at the base of the Templo Mayor, and it was still there. Under the streets of Mexico City, under the cathedral, under 500 years of trying to forget. They started excavating. They found the pyramid, layer after layer of it. 7 different construction phases, each one built over the last. They found the offerings, thousands of objects buried in ritual caches, jade and obsidian and coral and shells. They found the skull racks. They found everything the Spanish had tried to destroy, and it was still there, waiting. You travel south now, out of Mexico through Central America, down the spine of the Andes. The mountains here are different, taller, steeper. The air gets thinner, your lungs work harder. At 3,400 meters above sea level, in a valley in what is now Peru, you find Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. At its height, it stretched 4,000 kilometers from north to south, from modern Colombia to central Chile. It included deserts and rainforests and mountains and coasts. It had a population of perhaps 12 million people, and it was connected by roads, 40,000 kilometers of roads. Paved roads running through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. Up mountains, across deserts, through rainforests, with rope bridges spanning gorges hundreds of meters deep, with rest stations every 20 kilometers, with warehouses storing supplies for armies and messengers. The Inca didn't have wheels. They didn't have horses until the Spanish brought them. They had llamas and alpacas, which can't carry much weight and won't carry a rider. And they built a road network that wouldn't be matched in South America until the 20th century. They built it because they needed it. The empire was too large to control without communication. So they created the Chasqui system, relay runners, young men stationed at rest stops along the roads. A message would arrive. The runner would memorize it or carry a quipu, a knotted string recording system that encoded information in the type and position of knots. he would run to the next station. Hand off the message. The next runner would take it, day and night, across mountains, across deserts. A message could travel from Cusco to Quito, 2,000 kilometers away in less than a week. Fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor's table in Cusco, 300 kilometers inland and 3,400 meters up in 2 days. Still fresh. Carried by runners who sprinted up mountain passes in thin air and handed off their cargo to the next runner without stopping. The Inca didn't have writing, not the way the Maya did. They had quipus, knotted strings. Different colors, different types of knots, different positions on the string, all encoding information. Census data, tax records, astronomical observations, stories, poetry, everything a civilization needs to remember. We don't know how to read them, not fully. We know some of it. We can decode the numerical information. But the narrative content, the stories, the poetry, that's still locked. There are scholars working on it. There are maybe 600 quipus in museums around the world. And we're slowly, carefully learning their language, but most of what the Inca recorded is gone. The Spanish burned quipus too. They saw knotted strings and decided they were instruments of the devil. The city of Cusco was built in the shape of a puma. The head at the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, the body in the valley, the tail where 2 rivers met. Every street, every building, positioned deliberately to form the shape of the sacred animal. At the center, the Coricancha, the temple of the sun. Its walls were covered in gold, sheets of gold fitted together so precisely that you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. Inside, a garden, a golden garden. Golden corn with silver leaves, golden llamas, golden birds, everything made of precious metal arranged in a courtyard and offering to the sun god Inti. The Spanish took it all. They melted it down, turned it into bars, shipped it to Spain. They built a church on top of the Coricancha. But they kept the Inca walls because they couldn't build better ones. The Inca were master stonemasons. They cut stones so precisely that they fit together without mortar. No cement, no clay. Just stone on stone, fitted so perfectly that 500 years later, after earthquakes that destroyed the Spanish buildings on top of them, the Inca walls are still standing, still perfect. At Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above Cusco, there are stones weighing 200 tons, fitted together in walls that zigzag across the hillside. No one knows how they moved them, no one knows how they shaped them. The Inca had bronze tools. Bronze is softer than the stone they were cutting. Modern engineers have tried to replicate it. They can't, not with the precision the Inca achieved, not without modern tools. There are theories, wooden rollers, ramps, leverage, patience. Thousands of workers, decades of effort, but no one knows for sure. The Inca didn't write it down, and the Spanish didn't ask. They just took the gold and left. The empire fell faster than it rose. Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532 with 168 men. The Inca Emperor Atahualpa met him with 80,000 soldiers. Pizarro invited Atahualpa to a meeting, brought him into a courtyard, offered him a Bible. Atahualpa looked at it, held it to his ear. Heard nothing, threw it on the ground. Pizarro gave the signal. His men opened fire. Cannons, guns, steel swords against bronze and stone. They killed thousands. They captured Atahualpa. Pizarro demanded ransom, a room full of gold, another room full of silver. Atahualpa paid it, filled the rooms, more gold than the Spanish had ever seen. Pizarro took it. Then he killed Atahualpa anyway, strangled him. The empire collapsed. Civil war, disease, Spanish conquest. Within a generation, it was over. The roads fell into disrepair. The quipus were burned. The Golden Garden was melted down, and the Spanish built their cities on top of Inca foundations, using Inca stones, because they were better than anything Spain could build. Here's what survived. The stones, the roads, some of them, the terraces carved into mountainsides, still growing crops 500 years later. And Machu Picchu, the lost city, not lost to the Inca. Not lost to the people living in the valley below it, but lost to the outside world until 1911 when Hiram Bingham, an American historian, was led there by a local farmer. The city sits on a mountain ridge between 2 peaks, 2,430 meters above sea level, surrounded by cliffs, accessible only by a narrow path. It was built around 1450, abandoned around 1572. Why it was built, no one knows for sure. Royal estate, religious site, astronomical observatory, all of the above. The Spanish never found it. It was too remote, too hidden, so it survived. The stones are still there, the terraces, the temples. The Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, carved to track the solstices, all of it still standing, still perfect, still waiting. The civilizations of the Americas built all of this without steel, without wheels, without draft animals, without writing in some cases. They built it anyway, because they needed to, because they could. Because they looked at mountains and jungles and deserts and decided those weren't obstacles. They were opportunities, and then most of it was destroyed. Deliberately, systematically, the books burned. The temples torn down, the gold melted, the people killed by disease and conquest and slavery. We lost so much, but not everything. The stones are still there, the pyramids, the roads, the terraces, and in museums and archives around the world, the fragments, the 4 Maya books, the dozen Aztec codices, the 600 quipus, the carvings, the pottery, the gold that wasn't melted down. Scholars are reading it slowly, carefully, learning languages that were almost lost, decoding calendars, translating glyphs, understanding finally what should have been obvious from the beginning. The people who built these cities were not primitives, they were not savages. They were astronomers and mathematicians and engineers and artists. They were us, just with different tools, different languages, different gods. And what they built, what survived the burning and the conquest and the centuries of erasure is enough. Enough to know that they were here, that they built something extraordinary, that they looked at the sky and tracked the stars and calculated the future, that they carved their names into stone and expected to be remembered. And they were right. We remember, sleep well, dream of pyramids rising through jungle, of cities floating on lakes, of roads running through mountains, of astronomers tracking Venus, of stones fitted so perfectly they'll stand for another 1,000 years. And if you wake tomorrow in a world that eats tomatoes and potatoes and chocolate and corn, remember where it came from. Remember the people who gave it to you. Remember that they built civilizations, and most of what they built is still waiting, under the jungle, under the cities, under the ground, waiting to be found. Good night.